There's a very specific kind of nostalgia that hits differently. Not the warm, fuzzy kind you get from smelling your grandmother's cookies or hearing a song from your prom night. No, this is the kind that creeps up on you at 2 in the morning when your brain randomly decides to remind you that there was once a television show where a half-alien teenage girl could stop time by touching her index fingers together, and that you watched every single episode with complete and total sincerity. That's the out-of-this-world kind of nostalgia. And once it hits you, there's no shaking it. Out of This World premiered in 1987, slipping into American living rooms during one of the strangest periods in television history. The mid to late 80s were a wild time for the small screen. Networks and syndicators were throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck, and a surprising amount of genuinely bizarre stuff did stick, at least for a few years. Out of This World was perhaps the strangest thing that stuck. It was part family sitcom, part low-rent science fiction, part after-school moral lesson delivery system, and entirely, magnificently weird. And yet, for the kids who grew up watching it, the show left a mark that 4 decades and countless hours of prestige television haven't been able to fully erase. So today, we're going to dig deep into this forgotten gem. We're going to talk about where it came from, what made it so irresistibly strange, the cast that brought it to life, the special effects that defied all logic and budget, and the absolutely unresolved ending that left an entire generation of viewers hanging in the cosmic void. Buckle up, because we're heading out of this world. To understand Out of This World, you first have to understand the television landscape it was born into. By 1987, the major networks had already hit gold with family sitcoms. The Cosby Show was a cultural juggernaut. Family Ties had made Michael J. Fox a household name. Growing Pains was busy making everyone fall in love with Kirk Cameron. The formula was clearly working, and every producer in Hollywood was scrambling to find a fresh spin on the wholesome family comedy format. At the same time, science fiction was absolutely everywhere. E.T. had come out in 1982 and changed the cultural conversation permanently. Alf had debuted in 1986 and was pulling in enormous ratings with its premise of a wisecracking alien living in a suburban garage. If an alien puppet eating cats could win over American audiences, then surely there was room for more extraterrestrial storytelling on the family-friendly end of the dial. Into this environment stepped creators Bob Booker and John Boney, who looked at both trends and decided the most logical response was to combine them into something entirely their own. Their concept was straightforward enough on paper. A teenage girl discovers that her absent father is actually an alien from another planet, and on her 13th birthday, she inherits supernatural powers that she then proceeds to use, with wildly mixed results, while her very human mother tries to keep their completely abnormal life from flying completely off the rails. Simple, right? Except nothing about the execution was particularly simple, and that gap between concept and execution is exactly where the show's peculiar charm was born. The series found its home in weekend syndication after a brief and not especially successful flirtation with NBC's primetime block. That syndication slot turned out to be accidental genius. Saturday afternoon television in the late 80s was a lawless frontier, a place where reruns and odd programming choices ruled, and where kids with nothing better to do would watch basically anything put in front of them. Out of This World fit that environment perfectly. It wasn't trying to compete with The Cosby Show. It was competing with cleaning your room or mowing the lawn, and on those terms, it won every single week. At the center of everything was Evie Garland, brought to life by actress Maureen Flanagan, who was just 13 years old when the show began, and the fact that Flanagan was the exact same age as her character turned out to matter quite a bit, because the performance she gave was grounded in a kind of authentic teenage awkwardness that no amount of acting coaching could fully manufacture. She was genuinely navigating the weird territory between childhood and adulthood, and that authenticity came through every time the cameras rolled, even when the material she was working with was utterly absurd. Evie was, by any objective measure, a fascinating character for an 80s sitcom to build around. She was smart, curious, occasionally impulsive, and deeply committed to fitting in despite possessing abilities that made blending in essentially impossible. The show consistently gave her real emotional stakes. She wasn't just a vehicle for supernatural hijinks. She genuinely cared about her friendships, Her mother, her complicated relationship with a father she had never actually met, and the very ordinary teenage desire to be liked and understood. The fact that she could also stop time and conjure objects out of thin air was almost secondary to those very human concerns, at least in theory. In practice, the superpowers tended to cause most of the problems. Her primary ability, the one that became the signature of the entire series, was stopping time. The mechanics were beautifully simple. She pressed her 2 index fingers together. A boing sound effect played on the soundtrack, and everyone around her froze in place while she walked around freely, interacting with the suspended world. Later, she also developed the ability to gleep, which is one of those made-up verbs that somehow perfectly describes exactly what it means. Gleeping involved materializing objects from thin air, conjuring whatever she needed directly into existence, and eventually, she gained the power of teleportation, popping from one location to another instantaneously in the kind of narrative escalation that usually signals a writer's room running low on fresh ideas, but still committed to keeping things interesting. What made Evie compelling wasn't the powers themselves, but the consistent reminder that those powers came with real consequences. Every time she used her abilities selfishly or carelessly, there was a price to pay, usually in the form of her alien father temporarily disabling her powers as a form of cosmic grounding. It was a clever storytelling device that accomplished 2 things simultaneously. It delivered the mandatory moral lesson that 80s family television was legally required to include, and it saved the production a tremendous amount of money on special effects by giving them a legitimate in-universe excuse not to use them. Evie's family situation was, to put it gently, unusual. Her mother, Donna Garland, played by Donna Pescow, was a perfectly capable, intelligent, and loving woman who had once fallen in love with a man who turned out to be an alien, raised their daughter alone for 13 years, and then found herself co-parenting via a glowing crystal cube that only her daughter could actually hear or respond to. If that sounds like the setup for a psychological thriller rather than a family sitcom, you're not entirely wrong. Donna Pescow brought genuine warmth and comic timing to a role that could very easily have become a thankless straight woman part. She was funny, she was grounded, and she made the completely impossible circumstances of her character's life feel somehow emotionally believable. The fact that she was also serving as the principal of the school her half-alien daughter attended added another layer of absurdity to her situation, but Pescow played it with the kind of exhausted dignity that anyone who has ever had to maintain authority while everything around them is quietly chaos will immediately recognize. The show also added Evie's Uncle Bino, played by Joe Alaskey, as a regular presence in the household. Bino was the lovable, bumbling, good-hearted family member who existed primarily to generate physical comedy and to occasionally be in on the secret of Evie's heritage when the plot required a second adult who knew the truth. Alaskey committed fully to the role with the kind of elastic, throwback comedic energy that felt like it belonged to an earlier era of television, and somehow that anachronistic quality fit perfectly with the show's general vibe of being a little bit outside the mainstream even when it was trying its hardest to be conventional. Rounding out the regular cast was Doug McClure as Mayor Kyle Applegate, a local politician of steadily decreasing intellectual capacity whose trajectory across 4 seasons, from mildly dim-witted to cartoonishly oblivious, remains one of the more quietly remarkable character evolutions in late 80s syndicated television. The mayor existed mostly as a source of community-level comedy, the kind of broadly drawn authority figure that family sitcoms have always needed as a foil for their more sympathetic leads. And then there was Troy, Evie's alien father, the voice coming from a plastic box with a light bulb inside. The uncredited, entirely anonymous presence at the emotional center of a show about a girl searching for connection with a parent she had never actually seen. The voice of Troy was provided by Burt Reynolds. Let that sink in for a moment. Burt Reynolds, one of the genuine movie stars of his generation, the man who had charmed his way through Smokey and the Bandit, who had brought depth and bravery to Deliverance, who was by the late 80s still one of the most recognizable and bankable names in Hollywood, was recording fatherly advice for a low-budget syndicated sci-fi sitcom about a half-alien teenager, and he was doing it entirely as an uncredited personal favor. By all accounts, Reynolds recorded his dialogue for entire seasons in single marathon sessions, delivering lines of parental wisdom and alien perspective into a microphone, stripped of any visual context, trusting that the words alone would carry the emotional weight that the show needed. And remarkably, they did. There was something genuinely touching about the relationship between Evie and the voice of her father, something that transcended the technical limitations of a glowing plastic cube and the considerable absurdity of the premise. Reynolds brought a warmth and a genuine affection to his vocal performance that grounded even the silliest episodes in something real. The decision to keep his involvement secret was reportedly Reynolds' own. He wasn't interested in the publicity. He was doing it because he wanted to, as a favor to someone he respected, and the anonymity gave the voice of Troy a certain mystery that actually served the character well. You never quite knew what Troy looked like, and in the absence of a face, your imagination supplied whatever you needed. For a show aimed at kids and teenagers, that kind of active imaginative participation was more valuable than any casting decision could have provided. Any serious discussion of Out of This World has to spend significant time on the special effects because they are a marvel of human ingenuity operating under conditions of near-total resource scarcity. The production was not working with a large budget. This was not a secret to anyone involved, and the solutions the team developed for bringing Evie's supernatural abilities to life were creative in a way that only genuine constraint can produce. The time-stopping effect was the cornerstone. When Evie pressed her fingers together and the boing sound played, the rest of the cast simply stopped moving. They froze in whatever position they happened to be in, and Maureen Flanagan walked among them, adjusting props, rearranging situations, setting up whatever comic or dramatic payoff the scene required. That was it. No optical effects, no digital manipulation, no trick photography. Just disciplined actors holding very still and a teenager doing her best to sell the magic of a frozen world. And it worked. It absolutely, completely worked, not in spite of its simplicity, but because of it. There was something about the nakedness of the technique that engaged young viewers in a way that more sophisticated effects might not have. You could see exactly how it was done, which paradoxically made it easier to believe. Or maybe kids in the 80s were just more willing to meet a show halfway. Either way, the playground on the Monday after every episode was reportedly full of children pressing their index fingers together with deep concentration, absolutely convinced that with enough practice, they could figure out the trick. The gleeping effect was slightly more technically ambitious, usually involving quick cuts and some light-touch optical work that would register as primitive by any modern standard, but conveyed the general idea effectively enough. Objects appeared. That was the requirement, and the requirement was met. Troy's communication cube, meanwhile, was a plastic box with a light source inside, and a voiceover fed through a filter to give it a slightly processed quality. It looked like something you might find at a craft fair. It was the emotional anchor of the entire series. The 80s were a remarkable time. The show ran for 96 episodes across 4 seasons, and across that run it produced a collection of storylines that ranged from genuinely charming to magnificently bewildering, with most of them landing somewhere in the specific zone where those two qualities overlap. There were episodes about the complications of Evie trying to attend 2 important events simultaneously by splitting herself into 2 versions, an effect achieved through split-screen photography and a carefully positioned stand-in filmed from behind. There were episodes about accidentally granting supernatural abilities to people who had no framework for understanding what was happening to them, played for comedy in ways that occasionally stumbled into something darker and more interesting. There were episodes about the ordinary difficulties of teenage social life, navigating friendships, romantic feelings, the peculiar tyranny of high school hierarchies, with Evie's alien heritage serving as both the source of her problems and the resource she could draw on to solve them, sometimes wisely and sometimes catastrophically. What distinguished the best episodes was a genuine emotional intelligence underneath all the silliness. The show understood that the real story it was telling was about a girl growing up without a father present in any conventional sense, finding her identity in the space between 2 worlds, human and alien, belonging fully to neither. That's genuinely resonant material, and when the writers leaned into it rather than papering over it with supernatural hijinks, the show could be surprisingly affecting. And then there was the finale, or more precisely, the non-finale, the episode that ended the series without ending anything, leaving every unresolved thread permanently unresolved because nobody told the writers they were writing the last episode they would ever produce. After 4 seasons and 96 episodes, the show concluded with Troy finally making a physical appearance on Earth, appearing as a silhouette due to a teleportation complication that conveniently obscured the fact that no one had been cast to physically portray him. He had 4 hours. That was all the universe would allow. And in the chaos of his departure, when the interplanetary transport was activated to send him back to his home planet, Donna was accidentally transported instead, leaving her stranded in the far reaches of space on an alien world she had never seen, with Troy now trapped on Earth in her place. Then the credits rolled. That was the ending. That was where they left it. No resolution, no reunion, no sense of what would happen next. Just a mother stranded on an alien planet, and a daughter left standing in the aftermath, with absolutely no closure and no promise of any. The show was canceled before anyone realized they needed to write a real conclusion, which was a distressingly common fate for television series of that era, when the mechanics of syndication and network decision-making meant that a show could simply stop existing between one week and the next with no ceremony and no warning. For the kids who had invested 4 years of Saturday afternoons in Evie and her family, it was genuinely heartbreaking in the particular way that only unresolved fiction can be heartbreaking. You kept waiting for the resolution that never came, turning over possibilities in your head, constructing your own version of what happened after the credits. That imaginative work, involuntary and ongoing, is part of why the show stayed with people so long. The open wound of an unfinished story has remarkable staying power. The cast scattered after the show ended and landed in some genuinely interesting places. Maureen Flanagan continued acting, appearing in a range of television productions over the years, including Seventh Heaven and Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, before eventually moving toward documentary filmmaking. The girl who spent 4 years pretending to freeze time on a soundstage went on to tell real stories about the real world, which is a trajectory that feels both surprising and completely inevitable. Donna Pesco kept working steadily in television, turning up in Even Stevens and eventually The Sopranos, demonstrating a range that her work on Out of This World had perhaps not fully communicated. Joe Alasky went on to become one of the most significant voice actors of his generation, stepping into the roles of Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Tweety Bird after the passing of the legendary Mel Blanc. The physical comedian who played Uncle Beano found his true calling not in front of a camera, but behind a microphone, and the world of animation was significantly richer for it. Doug McClure continued acting until his death in 1995, leaving behind a long career that stretched back to the earliest days of television westerns. And Burt Reynolds, the voice that most viewers never knew they were hearing, went on to genuine late-career artistic reinvention, earning wide praise for his performance in Boogie Nights and reminding a new generation of audiences of the charisma and depth that had made him a star in the first place. He passed away in 2018, and somewhere in his remarkable legacy is 4 seasons of fatherly advice delivered to a glowing plastic cube, uncredited and unannounced, given freely as a favor and received by millions of children who had no idea who was talking to them. Out of This World was not a great television show by any conventional standard. The writing was uneven, the effects were primitive, the logic of its supernatural universe was applied inconsistently at best. It ended without ending. By every objective critical measure, it was a minor work produced under significant constraints for an audience that had limited alternatives. And yet it lodged itself in the memory of an entire generation with a tenacity that genuinely great television sometimes fails to achieve. There's something about its specific combination of emotional honesty and cheerful absurdity, its willingness to be exactly what it was without apology or pretension, that connected with young viewers in a way that outlasted the show itself by decades. It told a story about a kid who was different, who belonged to 2 worlds and fully to neither, who had extraordinary abilities that didn't make ordinary life any easier.